Good afternoon. Welcome to a special joint zoomcast with the American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord and the Simone Weil Center for Political Philosophy. Today, I'm joined by two of its board members, Paul Grenier, who's the president and co-founder of the center, and Paul Robinson of the University of Ottawa. Paul Grenier is going to help me with the questioning. He is a philosopher and widely published essayist who graciously joined the Acura Zoomcast a number of years ago to talk about his groundbreaking national interest essay on technocracy, which I will link to in the notes. Our guest is the great Paul Robinson, who has a new book out from Cornell. I'm going to let the motorcycle go by. Sorry. Who has a new book out from Cornell University Press titled Russian Liberalism, which may surprise many Americans who don't follow Russia closely as actually being something that exists. But just what kind of thing Russian liberalism is exactly is addressed brilliantly in Paul's new book. So Paul, we won't take up too much of your time today, but I could start things off by asking a very basic question. What was the impetus for you to write a book about liberalism in Russia?
Well, I had previously written a book on Russian conservatism, so it was in a sense a logical follow-on, you might say. So, given that generally speaking, people consider conservatism and liberalism to be sort of two predominant philosophies in modern politics, although strictly speaking they're not opposites. You can be a liberal and a conservative, but they're often considered as being slightly in contradiction to one another. But having tackled Russian conservatism, moving on to Russian liberalism seemed like a logical challenge.
Okay, Paul Grenier.
Yeah. So James, thank you for the invitation to join this, and Paul, it's really great to see you. The first question I had in the back of my mind is that bookshelf behind you looks really big and crammed with books. I just was thinking, my gosh, has he read all of these books? And let's not waste time with that. But I just first want to say that I'm glad that your book wasn't the size of a congressional omnibus bill with 2,000 pages that I had to read over the weekend. But nonetheless, I only had like a PDF copy of it, and I read with great fascination quite a bit of it. But some chapters that I thought we wouldn't focus on in this conversation, I kind of skimmed. But nonetheless, I can say that it's a terrific book. And so congratulations. The conservatism book was terrific, and this book is really, really good. And taken together, they make a real, I think they're just a great, like a course in Russian intellectual history and history at the same time, because you contextualize the thoughts and sort of follow a timeline, a progression throughout the book, so that people really can see the development of thought in both books. I just think it's a terrific achievement. I read with great interest the opening chapter, that of course the most theoretical one, where you tried to tackle what is liberalism in the first place, and to define the topic and the frame, the parameters within which you will be carrying out your inductive investigation. And it seems to me, Paul, that your approach was inductive, and you're gathering data of anything that calls itself liberal in a sense. And then at the end, I figure that maybe you or the reader will be able to figure out, well, what does liberalism really mean? Or what does liberalism really mean in the Russian context? If in case it's something different. I guess my first question was, would you personally decide? Is liberalism something specifically sui generis in the Russian context, or is there just a liberalism? And if so, what is it? And does that, scientific definition of liberalism pertain to the Russian case well?
Well, I think that obviously Russian liberalism shares some characteristics with other forms of liberalism elsewhere, and it's part of the the broad family of liberalisms, you might say. So as I point out in introduction, it's somewhat unwise to take a single definition of liberalism and go with that, because there are so many different varieties of liberalism. But if you go that way, you end up with a very strange idea of what's going on. So as you say, the idea was to take everything which has been called liberal and put it together and see what it means. And yes, I mean, clearly there are certain ideas Russian liberals have held, their belief in the rule of law, for instance, their belief in increased civil liberties, which are common to liberalisms wherever they may be. One particular feature, though, which of course makes Russian liberalism stand out from other liberalisms, is that it is very closely associated with Westernism. That's to say that to be a Russian liberal has historically meant to be a Westernizer. Not to say that all liberals are Westernizers and all Westernizers are liberals. It's not quite as close as that. Nonetheless, the correlation is extremely tight. And this means that to a large degree, Russian liberalism is about more than political change or economic change. In fact, the economic side of liberalism has tended to be fairly weak in Russia, but it is a cultural phenomenon, perhaps as much as anything else. It's about making Russia what Russian liberals would call a normal country, by which I mean, of course, a Western one. And that, of course, is not something which would be the case in the West, because Western liberals don't have to talk about becoming Western, right? It's not. Of course, you can then argue what is defined the West and so on, but nonetheless, it is a distinct thing in Russia, but it's associated with changing the country to become like a foreigner, you might say, or a foreign model. And in that sense, it's specifically, I wouldn't say anti-national, but specifically, stands in contradiction to how I define Russian conservatism, which was about organic change and changing in accordance with your own traditions and histories. So therefore, perhaps you might say a better division in Russian history is not so much between conservatives and liberals as between Westernizers and non-Westernizers. Again, these are not exact categories, but there is something to that.
Yeah, that comes out very well. And you make that point well in the book, and it's a recurring theme I noticed throughout the book. And I just thought that for the sake of keeping the discussion in my own brain straight, I thought maybe we could just sort of trace some highlights of your argument, starting in the early history and sort of then moving towards nearer points. But the same point that you're making keeps coming up, and it comes up very nicely in your discussion of the time of Alexander Herzen. And then at the same time, you're talking about Radishev and I think was it Novikov, I think. But there's some of the early liberals in the mid 19th century. Of course, there's even earlier than that, but just starting then arbitrarily, partly because a lot of people know who Alexander Herzen is in the West. That'll be meaningful with his, one interesting novel, Who is to Blame, that everyone should read. But some of the early liberals were clearly purely Westernizers, purely sort of Enlightenment Western intellectuals in exactly the sense you're saying. Whereas Herzen, though very left-wing, a non-believer, which in the time would be considered liberal in Russia, certainly, and a socialist and interested in freedom, but he was completely against individualism. He was sympathetic to, he was friendly with the Slavophiles and the people who wanted sort of a communal, non-Western bourgeois path in Russia. And you make an interesting point when you're discussing Herzen that he opposed European parliamentary democracy, and which I was intriguing. I didn't know much about that, but I just thought maybe you could expand on Herzen as an example of this peculiar Russianness, even of its liberalism, in that there was something specifically Russian about his take on the world. He didn't want to imitate. Maybe an exception that proves the rule in a sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, for that reason, many people don't consider Herzen to be a liberal. He's generally considered to be a radical rather than a liberal, because although he was a strong proponent of liberty, he was, not in favor of many of the precepts of classical liberalism, that's to say, free market economics and representative democracy. So it's very hard then to put on a liberal label onto him, although some people do. But in many ways, he has more in common, as you said, with Slavophiles, who are generally considered conservative. Although some people consider Slavophiles liberal too, because they were in favor of emancipating the serfs and of greater civil liberties and less government and stuff
freedom
like
of
that too.
speech.
So
freedom of speech, which
freedom
they
of
didn't get
speech,
much of.
absolutely, very strong advocates of freedom of speech. So these labels are very difficult to pin on people. And when you look at the 19th century, I quote one scholar who says that it's very hard to find what we would consider a liberal because it was impossible for someone to take the whole package. But you take some packs of liberalism, but other packs of conservatism and other packs of communitarianism or socialism, and put them together in odd combinations, which don't mean a lot to us here in North America or in Western Europe. So you have people in the late 19th century, like philosopher Vladimir Solovyov, who was a supporter of free theocracy, which is a sort of combination which to the modern secular liberal doesn't make any sense whatsoever. How can you be a liberal and a theocrat at one at the same time? But within a Russian context, made sort of sense. So, I mean, Solovyov, some of the stuff he wrote was strikingly progressive, even by modern standards. His ideas on penal reform, for instance, would have him marked down as an extreme pinko lefty, probably in modern day America. But he
against the death penalty.
Yeah, against the death penalty. He talked about the rights of prisoners, how prisoners have rights just as much as victims, and stuff like this. Whereas the liberals of the time were into eugenics almost, and believe that crime was something hereditary, and therefore you needed to isolate criminals from the rest of society so they didn't breed. So it's interesting how things come together in very strange combinations as we would consider it, and straight down the line classical liberals are quite hard to find. It doesn't mean they don't exist, but they're quite hard to find in Russian history.
Yeah, I'm glad you. Yeah, I.
Well, the enthusiasm for eugenics was shared by the U.S. Supreme Court in the early part of the 20th century, so it's something that we might have in common. I wanted to, sorry to interrupt, Paul, but you mentioned earlier that Russian conservatives tend to believe in organic change, while the liberals see the West as a model that would probably have to be imposed on society. And I wonder if that contributes to their kind of, what seems to me as an outside observer, kind of tortured relationship with their own people. And I'm reminded of one of my favorite blog posts of yours from the Great Irrationality blog was something that you wrote in 2015 called Cheesy Liberals. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, I remember that very well, yes.
It was about it was something about Mashy Gessen wrote something about how the sanctions, she couldn't get good cheese anymore because of the sanctions, but thank God that her and her friends could, get the expensive good stuff in London still.
They could get it in Terminal 4 in the duty free, yeah.
Can you, touch upon that kind of tortured relationship between? It's not dissimilar to the way I think American liberals see, their own fellow citizens in the hinterlands.
Yeah, well, I mean, because the aim of Russian liberalism is so associated with Westernism, the idea is therefore that, as I said, it's a cultural thing. So that leads to this idea of we intellectual, educated people have a superior Western culture, whereas godforsaken masses are still stuck in backward Russianness, or nowadays it would be in backward Sovietness, right? They're still Homo Sovieticus, right? And therefore, democracy is a slightly dangerous thing, because if the people have power, well, there's no hope of liberal reform whatsoever. And also, of course, in the 19th century, the aristocracy were also regarded, even though liberals came from the aristocracy, they tended to regard their fellow aristocrats as backward. So the kind of limited franchise democracy you tended to have in Europe was also dangerous, because that would put power in the hands of this limited number of reactionary aristocrats. So therefore, it was probably rather better to have an enlightened absolutism, which would, in its essence, force westernization upon society. And of course, then that comes back into play during the shock therapy era. We've just gone past the 30th anniversary of Yeltsin's attack on the parliament. And if you read some of the things, and I quote a few in the book, people said about the parliament and why it should be bombed into submission, it's very clear that opponents of economic reform were regarded as little more than fascists, scum, people who almost deserved to be killed. There's some quite frightening quotes. I have one from one of our colleagues, Anatole Lever, who I put a quote to. He said in the book, where he says he remembers some Russian liberal seeing protesters of old ladies complaining about their pensions under Yeltsin, said he'd happily shoot them. There is this cultural divide between the liberals who come from the sort of educated classes and ordinary Russians, and there's a tendency for both to look at each other with a fair degree of disdain, and for Russia's problems tend to be put down by the liberals. It's some would put it purely on Putin and say it's all Putin's fault, right? And all you've got to do is get rid of Putin, everything will be okay. But then there's others who say, and particularly after the annexation of Crimea, well, hang on, it's not just Putin. People seem to support Putin. And therefore, the fault lies deeper than Putin. It lies in the people and in their culture. And therefore, what we need is a wholesale cultural change of Russian society, because unless we do that, it doesn't matter who's in charge. We're just going to end up in the same old place. But of course, such a change can only come from on top.
Since we already jumped from the mid-19th century to Yeltsin period, I might as well abandon the idea of going through a methodical historical progression through your book. And I was interested in a passage where I think it's Alexei Karamurza is quoted at some length I think in chapter 11, where he's talking about how we need to have Russian society adapt to liberalism with Russian characteristics. Russia has its own tradition, has its own Christian tradition. And so we need to have an approach. Let's see, I've got a quote here, I think. Otherwise, radical liberalism, which denies the religion and values of national culture, will assume an approach similar to the Bolshevik dictatorship and scientific atheism. So he seems to be aware of exactly the problem that you're flagging. But the question, I guess, in my mind is, given that Russian national tradition arguably has been enunciated best of all by people like Solovyov and Dostoevsky, both of them, as was pointed out by our friend Boris Mizhuev in the piece on Solovyov that we published in the Simone Weil Center a couple of days ago. He points out that, of course, Dostoevsky and Solovyov knew each other and spoke about these topics. And he basically gives one to understand in his article that they both shared with each other the idea, or came to the conclusion, that the state should not be about a Leviathan state which sort of has all power and force, and then a civil society which enjoys autonomy from the Leviathan. And so that tension, which kind of expresses the liberal structure of society, they both rejected that and said, he said specifically that the brothers Karamazov was an expression of their joint idea that the polity should be a church. It should be like a church, but not as a dictatorial theocracy, but as literally as a free. People know should be coerced into orthodoxy, but that people should simply have fellowship. and it shouldn't be one. It shouldn't be a forced relationship of an all-powerful state, and then people fighting for their liberty from the all-powerful state. But instead, the whole quality of the country should be spiritually completely different than that. And it just makes me, when reading, pondering on that, I just wonders, is what Karl Moore's, I think people like Karl Moore's are very intelligent, and maybe they're right, and they're clearly very well-meaning. But logically, is it even possible to do what he's suggesting needs to be done to reconcile Western liberalism and the Russian idea?
It's difficult, though probably necessary if Russian liberalism is to establish strong roots, because I think the problem is, from a political perspective, the association of liberalism with Westernism, particularly in the context we have now of political conflict between East and West, serves to politically discredit it, and it's very easily used by its enemies against it to portray liberals as enemies of people almost. But I think there's another quote I put in the book from Alexander Tsipko, a Russian journalist, where he says Russia's problem is that people who value tradition don't value freedom, and people who value freedom don't value tradition. Is it possible, as you asked, to get someone who values both? That's difficult. I mean, the liberal would probably say, since the tradition is illiberal, it's asking the impossible. I don't know, to be honest, whether it's possible, Paul. I would simply suggest that in the current context, it would be very difficult for liberalism to have much by way of political prospects if it can't at least try and find some different way of expressing itself. Whether that's possible, I can't know. But I was obviously the previous method has not worked particularly well.
Yeah. James, I know we have a limited amount of time. I've taken up a lot of it already. I've got a couple more questions in the top of my mind, but James, please let me hug the microphone if you want, and tell us how much time we have.
No, I'm happy for you to do that. Why don't we wrap it up soon? Let's do another 5 minutes, and then we'll go.
Is that
okay with you, Paul Robinson?
That's fine. Yep.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's great fun. I'll skip over Stolypin. I think that's going to be too recondite for people listening to this broadcast. Although some other time, be nice to talk about the Stolypin reforms and that whole mess. And the passages you wrote on Bulgakov, I thought were extremely interesting. Also, for another conversation, we can skip over that. But there's the issue of there's a number of people you quote again in the last chapter about how I think Latinina and someone else talking about how there's no Russia without the West. That all of Russian music, Russian arts, Russian architecture, that it's all thanks to the West that it exists, and so there couldn't be any Russia without the West. At the same time, you have another parallel tradition, which to some extent, sometimes they borrow a term from Spengler, with that again, that Mazruyev likes to quote about pseudomorphism, that Russia takes ideas from the West and sort of fits them into its own gestalt and changes them. But that nonetheless, the actual idea of Russia was never actually European in the first place. And again, on our website, there's a really, it's a shortened version of my essay on Krylov, who comes up with the idea that Russia's political concept simply is not liberalism at all. That liberalism says, I do my thing, you do your thing. Or what, and the Russian idea is what is impermissible for anyone is impermissible as such. And that they're just completely different ethics.
I mean, I, the odd thing about this, Paul, is when I was a student of the Soviet Union, right? I came away thinking, my God, no, these people are not like us. And if they're to be like us, we need a whole generation of brought up in new values. As time has gone on, especially in the Putin years, it's actually become more and more like us. I mean, probably Russia's never been more westernized than it is now. And if you were to go from New York to Moscow today, it would be a much less alien place than it would have been if you'd gone to Moscow as I did in 1987, right? So it's kind of strange that this rift has happened between us at a time when we are actually probably culturally closer than we've ever been before. And I've never been convinced by this civilizational talk that Russia is a distinct civilization. But at the same time, the West is not or Europe is not a monolithic block, right? I mean, so I think it's Martin Malley in his book Russia Under Western Eyes who says Europe's like a bunch of circles and Russia's sort of the outermost circle almost, but it's part of the circle nonetheless, right? And even some Russian conservatives would be in my conservatism book. I quote Kolmogorov, who says, we're kidding ourselves if we think we can be Eurasian, because Asians, ask any Chinese person if we're Chinese. Ask an Indian person, and they'll tell you, no, you're not Asian. It's interesting.
You remember that essay by, I think you even referred to it, the Bogomolov essay, Похищение Европы.
Yes.
2.0.
Well, yeah, I know. So there is a feeling, if I interrupt, sorry, Paul, that, and I think this is part of the problem of Russian liberals have now. There's a very strong feeling that what we were part of is the old Europe before 1990 or something, right? And then something happened, and Europe went woke, and has left us behind. And you can see this in the article which I gave you about Chadaev, which you translated and put on the Samuel Center, where he says, they've we believed in a certain end of history, but now the Europeans have changed. The West has changed to the end of history, and the end of history isn't what we thought the end of, not the one we had signed up to. And even some liberals like Bogomolov and others don't sign up to it either, because and there's some speculation why this is, but part of it may be also because they associate a lot of these things with modern identity politics, with the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union always played that sort of card. It was always playing the anti-racism card and the feminist card and all that stuff. And maybe the Soviet Union was completely hypocritical in doing so, but it did. So consequently, when Russian liberals see the Western states now doing this, they say, you're just like the communists. And they don't like it very much. So there is an issue there about, there's a problem for the Westernizers in that many of them believe in a type of West which arguably doesn't exist anymore. And therefore, what is it they're going to believe in when the West is no longer, their belief is the West of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Yeah. And of course that isn't here nowadays.
I think that's an excellent point. And maybe that's a good, that brings in a way the discussion, I think, nicely to a point of sort of the crisis where we're at. And it helps clarify, Paul, nicely why there's such a failure of any kind of dialogue. Because it now, it's almost like people being raised in the same family and then living apart for 40 years, and then they have a conversation and they get in arguments because they don't realize that they're different people and not the kids that they grew up with. And that the people, I think in Russia kept thinking, well, of course they'll understand what we are saying when we suggest X, Y, Z. And maybe the same thing goes in the other direction. But in fact, they have different premises, different philosophies. They're living in completely different worlds.
Yeah, I mean that sadly could be well be the case, in which case we're sadly at an impasse. And I'm not very. I always have generally been an optimist, but I have to say, with recent events, I've become slightly rather less optimistic.
Right. Well, I think on that note, we'll have to leave it. Paul Robinson, thank you very much for joining us. Good luck with the book.
Thank you.
And Paul Grenier, thank you very much for helping out today. Appreciate it. Good seeing you guys.
And thanks for the invitation, James. It was fun. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, thank you.